Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In today's first segment, we're going to discuss Iranian ballistic missiles. Now, as some of you may know, 3 European countries have sent a letter to the United Nations Security Council speaking about Iran's ballistic missile program and expressing concern that it is now in violation of the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, that was signed back in 2015. The JCPOA stating in the UN resolution that was passed soon after that deal was signed that Iran would not make missiles, or produce missiles, I should say, that would be capable of carrying nuclear warheads. Now, the Iranians say that these missiles, specifically the Shahab-3, I believe, which the Europeans are most concerned about, they say that they have no intention of putting a nuclear warhead on that. But do the Europeans have a point, or are they, as Foreign Minister Zarif of Iran says, are they trying to distract from the reality on the ground, really, that they haven't been able to actually save the JCPOA either, considering the U.S. did walk away from it and Iran hasn't then reaped the benefits as it was promised under the deal. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Ahmad Hashemi, who is an Iranian freelance journalist and an expert on Middle East region and global geopolitical trends. He's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Joining us from Berlin is Hans-Jakob Schindler, who is Senior Director of Counter-Extremism Project New York and Berlin. He's a former German official who served in Iran between 2005 and 2011. Hans-Jakob and Ahmad, thank you both for your time today. Hans, let me start with you. What do you make of the European letter to the UNSC? The Foreign Minister Zarif of Iran saying it's disingenuous, essentially, because the Europeans haven't actually been able to save the deal. So it's kind of rich for them to then be coming out and pointing the fingers at Iran.
Well, I mean, let's distinguish a couple of things here. On the one hand, is the sanctions relief, where Mr. Zarif is having a point that sanctions relief did not work the way it was intended, mainly because of the unilateral U.S. withdrawal. And then there is the question of the Iranian Ballistic Missile Program. And the Europeans have been watching this program for a number of years with growing concerns. Now, it is important to mention that there is no international objective decision of what a ballistic missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead is, but in essence, we are talking about range and payload. Now, the Iranians have increased both aspects of their missile program over the last couple of years, and they're now reaching a point where the payload and the range is sufficient to mount a rather substantial warhead on it, and a rather substantial warhead can also be a nuclear device. So one has to ask the question, why do they need increasing payloads and increasing ranges if this is just a defense weapon for regional rivals? Why would not smaller and lighter rockets be sufficient for that?
Ahmad, what do you think of that argument? Because I imagine the Iranians would turn around and say, listen, we have a right to produce these weapons. Even Brian Hook, who is the U.S. Special Representative for Iran and a senior policy advisor to Pompeo, has said, in fact, that one of the weaknesses of the JCPOA was that it allowed Iran to produce ballistic missiles, saying that the ballistic missile tests and the ballistic missile program is not prohibited under the deal.
Of course, theoretically, Iran is allowed to produce the weapons. Iran is allowed and entitled to all the weapons and all the preventive measures that the other countries are using. But we are not living in void. We are not living in a perfect world. And there's always context to what countries do. So Iran has shown time and again that it's not a trustworthy member of international community. In 2003, when one of the opposition forces, they revealed Iran's nuclear program, which had a military aspect as well, the world community was shocked, even though many intelligence agencies were expecting that, and there were different analyses. Iran has shown that it is a revisionist regime. It wants to challenge the international order, world order, whether we like it or not. It's not based on justice. It's not based on fairness and equality.
To be fair to the Iranians, Ahmed, if I may push this, because the Iranians would argue, listen, we stuck to the nuclear deal for as long as we could. And even, the IAEA and others admitted that Iran was sticking to its end of the bargain under the nuclear deal. So why not reward good behavior by actually giving Iran what it was promised under the deal?
Again, because of two reasons. Two reasons. One is it is a revisionist regime. It has tried to get the nuclear weapons, and even some officials, the former officials, have talked about it, the necessity of having preventive measures, even if they didn't directly mention the nuclear bomb. The circles familiar with the terms, they knew that this means a nuclear bomb. And then the other thing is that Iran is, as we saw in the last couple of weeks, it's a very brutal regime when it comes to murdering its own people. It's a country that again challenges the world order, as well as it challenges even the very existence of countries like Israel. So again, this is a country that has shown in different stages that it cannot be trustworthy. That's why different standards and criteria are applied to Iran when it comes to its, even if it's defensive capabilities.
Hans, what do you make of that lot? I mean, I personally would find that troubling because, again, it would just create this very unequal and confusing way of running the world then, right? Where if you have signed a deal, and of course there was a deficit of trust, and there was always meant to be a deficit of trust. That's why there were all these checks and balances that were spoken about within the deal. Do you not think that at some level, though, with Iran respecting its end of the bargain, till recently, of course, till when it felt that it couldn't anymore regarding its economy or whatever arguments we may make, that it should have been rewarded for that good behavior?
Yeah, look, I mean, I would say that the deal was signed in order to take care of that lack of trust. That's why there are so many quite detailed provisions within the deal from as far as the nuclear program is concerned, in order to take care of that lack of trust that was created by some Iranian activities over the last 2 decades, which weren't exactly open and honest in what they were doing with the nuclear program. I would also argue from a European perspective that the Europeans have done what they promised. They promised sanctions relief, so they actually struck all of those companies and ships and individuals from their sanctions list. They also made sure that there is a Security Council resolution which released sanctions and replaces them with a few restrictions, not sanctions, but restrictions on the delivery of material that is capable to enhance the Iranian ballistic rocket program in order to prevent them from becoming a nuclear-capable weapon. So from the European side, even after the difficulties with the U.S. administration arose, further actions were taken. The blocking statute was passed as a European law, and INSTEX was created, and even last week, 6 more countries joined INSTEX. So to say to the Europeans they haven't done their level best to make sure that this deal is working from their side would be unfair. I agree that the actual economic relief that the Iranians hoped did not materialize because of the parallel policy of maximum pressure by the U.S. administration. But just because one side acted unfairly doesn't mean automatically that the other side now can say all bets are off. A deal is a deal is a deal.
But then, Hans, I imagine the Iranians were arguing, and you obviously know the details of this well also, about deals such as the ones that the Iranians signed with Airbus, for example, or the deals signed with many energy companies such as Total of France or others, that were meant to, be either, involved in Iran in some fashion or selling their products, i.e. aviation and airplanes. All of them walked away, right, once the U.S. sanctions were placed. So, again, I understand your point where the Europeans are in a tough position, too, but then you understand the Iranian point of view in this also, right, where Foreign Minister Zarif then would say, or others would have this excuse that turn around and say, listen, you didn't actually hold up your end of the bargain, or you need to do better for us to stay in the deal.
Absolutely, but, you have to take recognition of the reality. The reality is, if we want to make any headway, we need to come to additional agreements, because otherwise this is not going to lead anywhere. So, the missile program is a concern both for the U.S. as well as the Europeans. And we have seen the development of the ballistic missile program over the last couple of years. We've seen them demonstrating their capabilities, whether they've done it directly or indirectly with the latest attack on the Saudi oil facilities. So, they have not been holding back on this point. So there is a point, I think, where both sides can come together to try to salvage the whole situation. Because what is the alternative? Continuing economic chaos in Iran. This is not a good alternative for either side, neither for the Europeans nor for the Iranians. So,
indeed, on that point then of economic chaos, if I may, because of Ahmad with that. Ahmad, the Iranians would argue that, listen, the economic chaos that we're currently seeing playing out in Iran at this point in time, we can talk about the currency devaluation, lack of medicines, specialized medicines, that is, for cancers and et cetera, that is all the fault of the Americans / even possibly the Europeans, because under the deal, Iran was supposed to open up to the world, et cetera. Do you think that there is some truth to that? Because it's, obviously, even taking into account mismanagement, there is a factor of sanctions, isn't there?
Of course, when it comes to obeying the international order, obeying the rules and regulations, and the membership to the international organizations, the United States has no the current administration in the U.S. has no good reputation for that. There's no doubt about it. But again, it's all about the power dynamics. It's all about the hegemony and power. If Iran decides today that is to put aside its the ideological aspect of its domestic and foreign policy, the destruction of Israel and fighting the so-called global arrogance and etc. And if Iran decides to be flexible when it comes to its interactions with the international community, international world order, which means to a large extent have good relations with the United States. Rather than being a hostile regime, to be like an ally for the United States, then we will have a totally different dynamics. The situation, something similar to Israel. We know Israel is the only country.
But then, Ahmad, to be fair again to the Iranians, I'm just taking their side because I want to play devil's advocate to balance this conversation. That the Iranians would say, and Rouhani actually just recently said that, listen, we'll actually talk to the U.S. directly or within the P5+1 structure if sanctions were lifted. So it's not like the Iranians are completely against talks with America, right?
So America has understood the fact that even though people are suffering, even though there are some collateral damage to the maximum pressure campaign, it is working. It really is working. It's creating chaos. It is creating riots in Iran, and it is weakening Iranian government. And there are many parties, including in the United States, in the region, Sunni and Arab countries, Israel, that are happy about seeing this situation in Iran. So when the maximum pressure policy, the maximum pressure campaign is working, and the United States doesn't need to resort to the military option to counter Iran's efforts. So why not? Why not continuing the maximum pressure policy? Of course, I'm looking from the U.S. perspective. That's why the United States is not serious when it comes to the negotiation.
Just before letting you both go, I want to get a fight from Hans. Hans, just on the outside then, what do you think is going to be happening at this point in time when it comes to the European, the European view on this situation at this point in time? Do you think that they're going to now take a harsher stance? And then what does that then mean for their relations, for the EU relations with Iran, be it in the context of the nuclear deal or otherwise?
Well, we are entering a more complicated phase. I mean, first of all, the definition of what's working and what's not working is very much in the eye of the beholder. Chaos itself is not an aim in itself. There needs to be some strategy behind of where the end point is, for what it is working in which way. And I think there is still a lot of definitional work to be done on the U.S. side, what they actually want, right, except for chaos. Obviously, there are major concerns on the European side. With what happened in the last couple of weeks, and we just had a discussion a couple of weeks ago about how bad that was. Yeah. And B, the continuing Iranian missile activities. Both do have serious consequences and doesn't make the atmosphere between Europe and Iran easier. Neither one of which, however, is a good argument to say we shouldn't talk. The arguments we can only talk when sanctions are relieved is an argument that, in the early 2000s, Iran has tried and has failed. Obviously, sanctions are in place in order to enable talks. If you lift sanctions before you talk, the whole point of sanctions is reversed. So there is very unlikely any major sanctions relief before talks start. So I hope that over the last couple of months, both sides will actually find a way to get to talk about concrete issues rather than throwing accusations at each other.
Very well. Ahmad and Hans, we do your time today, of course, and for your insight. We're going to be back, viewers, with this very same topic after this break. Stay tuned for us.